When I saw Nate holding the vibrator from my package, his face a mix of shock and curiosity, I felt my heart stop. The moment felt endless. He stood there in the living room, the open box of items on the coffee table, holding something no stepson should ever see. His eyes darted between the object in his hand and me as I froze in the doorway, clutching a basket of folded laundry. Evelyn, he stammered, his voice breaking the unbearable silence. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped, setting the basket down with trembling hands. My cheeks burned, a mix of anger and humiliation washing over me as I crossed the room, snatching the item from his hand. "I didn't mean," Nate began, stepping back defensively. "I didn't know what it was. The package was just sitting here and You thought you'd open it?" I cut him off, slamming the rest of the items back into the box and snapping the lid shut. "You had no right, none, to touch it." Nate ran a hand through his hair, his face redder than I'd ever seen it. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I thought it was like tools or something." "Tools?" I echoed, incredulous. "Does this look like tools to you?" He glanced at the now closed box, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for a response. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low. "I wasn't trying to." "Just forget about it," I interrupted, clutching the box tightly as I turned toward the stairs. "Forget this ever happened." But as I stormed out of the room, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't just embarrassment or guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. The incident replayed in my mind over and over as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Nate had apologized, sure, but something about the way he'd looked at me, confused, unsure, lingering just a second too long, stuck with me. And then there was me. My reaction had been more than just embarrassment. It was anger at myself, at the vulnerability that came with someone knowing something so private about me. Carl, my husband, had never even asked about my needs. Hell, he barely noticed when I was in the same room anymore. Those items in the package, they were a small rebellion, a way to reclaim some sense of control over my neglected life. But now, Nate knew. And knowing him, he wasn't going to forget. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, staring into his coffee cup like it held all the answers in the world. When he looked up and saw me, his posture stiffened. "About yesterday," he started, his voice cautious. "Drop it," I said quickly, pouring myself a cup of tea and keeping my back to him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he continued, ignoring my attempt to shut him down. "I shouldn't have opened it. It's none of my business." "You're right," I said sharply, turning to face him. "It's not." He nodded, the tension thick between us. "It won't happen again." Good. But even as I said the word, I could feel his eyes on me. And I knew this wasn't over. It had been 3 weeks since Nate opened that package, but the awkwardness between us lingered like a shadow in the house. For the most part, we danced around each other, pretending nothing had happened, though I could feel his presence in every room. And when our paths crossed, whether it was in the kitchen, the living room, or the garden, the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Carl, of course, remained oblivious. My husband had mastered the art of distraction, burying himself in work and hobbies, to the point where he barely noticed the tension simmering beneath the surface. That was the story of our marriage, really. 2 people sharing a house but living entirely separate lives. Carl and I had married when I was 46, after a whirlwind romance that now felt like a lifetime ago. At the time, I thought he was everything I wanted: successful, charming, stable. But stability has a way of turning into monotony, and as the years passed, his attention drifted elsewhere. He was always on the phone, always in meetings, always too tired to notice when I dressed up or asked him about his day. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that this was just what marriage looked like after so many years. But when I found myself ordering that package, an act born out of loneliness and quiet defiance, I knew something had shifted. And then Nate moved back in. Nate was nothing like Carl. Where Carl was rigid and predictable, Nate was easygoing, spontaneous, curious. He had a way of making the house feel alive again, whether it was through the music he played while cooking or the stories he told about his failed tech startup. At 25, he was still trying to figure things out, though Carl wasn't shy about reminding him that he needed to get his act together. Nate took the criticism in stride, shrugging it off with a grin and a joke that usually made me laugh despite myself. "You know, Evelyn," he said one afternoon as we worked side by side in the garden, "my dad acts like he's got it all figured out, but half the time, I don't think he even knows what he's saying." I laughed, shaking my head. "You shouldn't talk about your father like that." "Why not?" he said, smirking. "It's not like he listens to me anyway." His honesty was refreshing, disarming even. And though I tried to keep our conversations light, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing something I didn't even realize I was showing. The first real shift happened one evening when Carl was out of town on a business trip. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Nate walked in. He lingered by the counter, watching me as I scrubbed the dishes. "Need help?" he asked. "I've got it," I said, glancing at him. "But thanks." He didn't leave. Instead, he grabbed a towel and started drying the plates I handed him. For a while, we worked in silence, the rhythmic clinking of dishes the only sound in the room. Then he spoke. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, "about the package." I stiffened, my hands pausing in the soapy water. "I thought we agreed to drop it." "I know," he said quickly, "but I can't stop thinking about it." I turned to face him, my heart racing. "There's nothing to think about, Nate. It was a mistake, an accident." He set the towel down, his gaze steady. "Was it?" "Yes," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. I see how he treats you, how lonely you are." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "You deserve more," he said softly. I shook my head, stepping back. "This conversation is over." But as I walked out of the kitchen, I couldn't ignore the way my chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The tension only grew after that night. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark, and I found myself avoiding Nate whenever I could. But it didn't matter. He was everywhere. In the kitchen, in the garden, even in my dreams. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, he appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet. I looked up, my hands stilling over the towel in my lap. "What is it?" He hesitated, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Leaving?" "This house. My dad. All of it," he said, his tone measured. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said, his eyes locking on mine. "You don't have to stay here if you're not happy." His words sent a jolt through me, and I looked away, focusing on the towel in my hands. "It's not that simple, Nate." "Maybe it is," he said softly. When I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. And in that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. It happened on a stormy night. The kind where the rain lashes against the windows and the house feels quieter than usual. Carl had called earlier to say he'd be staying late at work again. That left just me and Nate, sitting in the living room with the faint hum of the television playing in the background. He was sprawled on the couch, his long legs stretched out, while I sat in the armchair, a book open in my lap that I hadn't read a single word of. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and tonight, it felt unbearable. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know," Nate said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I looked up from my book, startled. "Pretending?" "That you're okay," he said, sitting up now, his eyes locked on mine. "That everything in your life is fine. It's not." I set the book down, my heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "You don't have to lie to me, Evelyn. I see you. I've always seen you." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "This is inappropriate," I said, standing abruptly. "I think you should." "Why do you do that?" he interrupted, standing as well. "Do what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Push people away," he said, stepping closer. "You deserve to be happy, Evelyn. You deserve to feel alive." I shook my head, backing away. "This is wrong, Nate. You know that." "Is it?" he asked, his gaze steady. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "Not with me." And then he kissed me. The first kiss was tentative, hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally broke apart, my heart was pounding, and I stared at him, unsure of what to say. "We can't do this," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't regret it." Neither did I, though I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I turned and left the room, my mind spinning. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We tried to act normal when Carl was around, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, Nate appeared behind me, his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my breath catching at the look in his eyes. "What is it?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "We shouldn't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Neither could I. The affair escalated quickly. It was like a dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood. One night, while Carl was away on a business trip, Nate and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, though my hands trembled with every book I touched. "Do you ever feel trapped?" he asked, breaking the silence. I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "Like you're living someone else's life," he said, his voice quiet. I hesitated before nodding. "All the time." He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You don't have to stay here, Evelyn. You don't have to stay with him." "I don't have a choice," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "There's always a choice," he said, his hand reaching for mine. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and before I knew it, I was in his arms, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left me breathless. We were careful, or at least we tried to be. But the secrecy only made it more exhilarating. One afternoon, while Carl was at the office, Nate and I were in the garden, hidden behind the tall rose bushes. I laughed as he reached for a pair of pruning shears, his hand brushing against mine. "You're terrible at this," I teased. "Maybe I just like the company," he said, his tone playful. The moment shifted as he stepped closer, his hand lingering on mine. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. But as thrilling as our affair was, it came with its share of risks. One evening, while Carl was out with friends, I found myself in Nate's room. We were sitting on his bed, talking in hushed tones, when we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "Shit," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. Nate grabbed my hand, his expression serious. "Go, I'll cover for you." I nodded, slipping out of his room and down the hall just as Carl walked through the front door. My heart was racing, but I managed to keep my composure as I greeted him in the foyer. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. "Poker got canceled," he replied, his tone distracted. "Where's Nate?" "In his room, I think," I said quickly, hoping he wouldn't notice the flush in my cheeks. Carl nodded, heading toward the kitchen, and I let out a shaky breath, relieved that we'd avoided disaster. But we couldn't avoid it forever. The closer Nate and I grew, the more difficult it became to hide. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets have a way of unraveling. No matter how carefully you try to keep them hidden, the weight of them pulls at the seams of your life until everything begins to fray. For weeks, Nate and I thought we were in control, but the cracks were beginning to show. It started with Lila, Carl's business partner, who had a habit of stopping by unannounced. "Lila's here," Carl said one Saturday afternoon, his voice carrying through the house as I stood in the kitchen preparing lunch. I froze for a moment, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. Lila had a reputation for being nosy, and the thought of her snooping around the house sent a chill down my spine. "Tell her I'll be right out," I called back, forcing my voice to stay steady. When I walked into the living room a few minutes later, Lila was perched on the edge of the couch, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Evelyn," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So good to see you." "You too, Lila," I replied, sitting down across from her. She leaned back, crossing her legs. "Carl tells me Nate's been staying with you. How's that going?" "Fine," I said quickly. "He's been a big help around the house." "I'll bet," she said, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. It must be nice having someone around while Carl's at work all the time. The implication in her words was clear, and I felt my chest tighten. We're just glad we can support him while he figures things out, I said, keeping my tone light. Lila's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. Of course. That evening I told Nate about the conversation. She knows something, I said, pacing the length of the library as he sat on the couch watching me. She's guessing, Nate replied, his tone calm. She doesn't have anything concrete. She doesn't need anything concrete, I shot back. She just needs Carl to start asking questions. Nate stood, crossing the room to place his hands on my shoulders. We're careful, Evelyn. She can't prove anything. His touch was reassuring, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to loosen. Then, there was Matt, Nate's childhood friend who had recently moved back to town. He showed up one afternoon while Carl was at work, his arrival unannounced but not entirely surprising. Matt, Nate said, his voice filled with genuine surprise as he opened the door. Thought I'd stop by, Matt said with a grin, clapping Nate on the shoulder. Catch up for a bit. I was in the kitchen when they walked in, and the sight of Matt made my stomach churn. He had a sharpness to him, a perceptiveness that made me uneasy. Evelyn, he said, his grin widening as he saw me. Still as lovely as ever. Matt, I replied, forcing a smile. It's been a while. Nate glanced at me, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Matt. Let's catch up outside, he said quickly, steering his friend toward the patio. But even from the kitchen, I could hear snippets of their conversation. She's different than I remember, Matt was saying. Don't start, Nate replied, his tone warning. Relax, Matt said, laughing. I'm just saying. You've been spending a lot of time here, haven't you? What's your point? Nate asked, his voice tight. Nothing, Matt said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just be careful, man. People talk. The tension in the house was reaching a breaking point. Carl was growing more suspicious, Lila's visits were becoming more frequent, and Matt's prying had left Nate on edge. One evening, while Carl was out with Lila at a business dinner, Nate and I were in the library, our usual refuge. We can't keep this up, I said, my voice trembling. We've been careful, Nate said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Not careful enough, I replied, pacing the room. Carl's starting to notice, and Lila doesn't know anything, Nate interrupted, his tone firm. She doesn't have to, I said, my voice rising. She just has to say the right thing to Carl, and everything will fall apart. Nate stood, crossing the room to take my hands in his. We'll figure it out, he said softly. We always do. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of our secret was becoming too much to bear. The breaking point came 2 days later. Carl came home early from work, his expression dark as he walked into the house. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when he appeared in the doorway. We need to talk, he said, his tone cold. I set down the dish I was holding, my heart pounding. What's wrong? I had lunch with Lila today, he said, crossing his arms. She told me some interesting things. I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to stay calm. Like what? Like how you and Nate have been spending a lot of time together, he said, his eyes narrowing. More than usual. He's my stepson, Carl, I said quickly. Of course we spend time together. Don't play dumb, Evelyn, he snapped. Lila thinks there's something going on, and now I'm starting to wonder if she's right. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his accusation hung in the air, and for the first time I felt the walls closing in. That night, I found Nate in his room, packing a bag. What are you doing? I asked, my voice trembling. Leaving, he said shortly, not looking at me. You can't, I said, stepping closer. I have to, he replied, his voice breaking. It's only a matter of time before he finds out, and if he does... He trailed off, shaking his head. I won't let him hurt you, I said, my eyes filling with tears. Nate turned to face me, his expression softening. You can't protect me, Evelyn, not from this. Before I could respond, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. I'll call you, he said quietly. And then he was gone. For the first few days after Nate left, the house felt impossibly quiet. I went through the motions, cleaning, cooking, pretending to watch television, but every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of him. Carl, oblivious as ever, treated Nate's abrupt departure as a sign of his son finally taking responsibility for his life. But I knew better. Nate had left to protect us, or at least to protect me. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, no matter how far you try to bury them. It began with Carl acting strangely, more distant than usual, but not in his typical preoccupied way. He wasn't spending time in his study or watching his financial news shows like he always did. Instead, he spent hours on his laptop in the evenings, shutting the screen anytime I walked by. One night, after he went to bed, I crept into the study and turned on his computer, curious about what he was hiding. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Dozens of emails between Carl and Lila, the subject lines vague, but the tone unmistakably conspiratorial. Lila, I'll dig deeper and see if anyone else noticed anything. Let me know what you find. I'm starting to think I was blind to all of it. The implication was clear. They were watching me. I didn't tell Nate, I couldn't. He had left to protect me, and dragging him back into this mess felt selfish. But as the days passed, Carl's suspicion grew more overt. You've been quiet lately, he said one morning over breakfast, his tone too casual. I'm always quiet, I replied, keeping my eyes on my plate. He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. True, but something feels off, don't you think? I looked up at him, forcing a smile. I don't know what you mean. Carl leaned back in his chair, studying me. You're sure there's nothing you want to tell me? My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. Nothing at all. A week later, the real twist came. I was in the garden trimming the roses when Matt showed up. He leaned on the fence, watching me with an expression that made my skin crawl. Long time no see, he said, his tone teasing. What do you want, Matt? I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. Just checking in, he said, shrugging. Nate's been staying at my place, you know. That made me freeze. He has? Matt smirked. He didn't tell you? Interesting. I set down the pruning shears, my patience wearing thin. Is there a point to this visit, or are you just here to waste my time? His smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Lila came to see me, he said. The blood drained from my face. What did she want? To know if I'd noticed anything strange between you and Nate, he said bluntly. And what did you tell her? I asked, my voice trembling. Relax, Matt said, holding up his hands. I didn't say anything, but I figured you should know she's digging. That evening, I received a message from Nate. I think Matt knows something. Be careful. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. If Matt was talking to Lila, it was only a matter of time before Carl confronted me. It happened sooner than I expected. Carl came home early one afternoon, his expression cold and unreadable. He found me in the living room, folding laundry, and sat down across from me without a word. Carl? I asked, uneasy. Lila told me something interesting today, he said, his voice dangerously calm. I set down the laundry, my heart pounding. What did she say? She said she overheard Matt talking about you and Nate, he replied, his gaze piercing. About how close the two of you had gotten. That's ridiculous, I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Is it? Carl asked, leaning forward. Because I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. How Nate moved in and suddenly you seemed different, happier, distracted. I shook my head, my chest tightening. You're imagining things, Carl. Am I? He snapped, his voice rising. Because I don't think I am, Evelyn. I think there's something you're not telling me. I stood, my hands trembling. You're being paranoid. Am I? He repeated, standing as well. Or have you been lying to me this whole time? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the doorbell rang. I wasn't prepared for who was standing on the other side of the door. Nate, what are you doing here? I whispered, my heart racing as I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me. I had to see you, he said, his expression tense. Matt's been acting weird. I think he's trying to set you up. Carl already knows something, I said, my voice shaking. He confronted me just now. Nate's jaw tightened. Then we need to tell him the truth, before someone else does. You don't understand, I said, my eyes filling with tears. If he finds out, he'll. Evelyn? Carl's voice called from inside. I turned, panic flooding through me. What's going on out here? Carl asked, stepping onto the porch. His eyes flicked between me and Nate, and I could see the pieces falling into place in his mind. Carl, I can explain, I began, but he held up a hand to silence me. You don't need to, he said, his voice cold. I've heard enough. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Carl demanded answers, his voice echoing through the house as he accused me of betraying him. Nate tried to defend me, but his presence only made things worse. By the time Carl stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, I was left trembling and unsure of what to do next. Nate placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steadying me. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. But as I looked at him, I knew the damage had already been done. Carl didn't come home that night. I paced the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. Nate sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together as he watched me with a mixture of worry and determination. "You should go," I said, stopping mid-step to look at him. "No," he replied firmly, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone." "This isn't your fight, Nate," I said, my voice trembling. "It's mine." He stood, stepping toward me. "It's our fight," he said softly. "I won't abandon you, Evelyn." The tenderness in his voice nearly broke me, but before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent my heart into a spiral. "It's him," I whispered. Nate tensed, his jaw tightening as he moved closer to me. "Whatever happens, I'm here." The front door swung open moments later, and Carl walked in. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and the look on his face was a storm of anger and betrayal. He stopped in the entryway, his eyes locking onto me first, then shifting to Nate. "I thought I made myself clear," Carl said coldly, his gaze hardening. "You were supposed to leave." "Carl, please," I said, stepping forward. "Let's talk about this." "Talk?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You want to talk now, after everything?" He turned to Nate, his hands curling into fists. "How long has this been going on?" Nate didn't flinch. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," Carl shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I didn't see the way you looked at her? The way she looked at you?" "It's my fault," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "Don't blame him. I'll blame whoever I damn well want," Carl snapped, his eyes blazing. "You betrayed me, Evelyn, both of you." Nate stepped in front of me, his body shielding mine. "If you want to blame someone, blame me," he said firmly. "But don't take it out on her." Carl laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Listen to you, acting like some kind of hero. You're nothing but a spoiled little boy playing house with someone else's wife." "Stop it," I shouted, my voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't helping anyone." Carl turned to me, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Do you even care what you've done? You've destroyed this family." I stared at him, tears streaming down my face. "This family was broken long before Nate came home. You just didn't want to see it." For a moment, Carl said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned and grabbed his coat from the rack. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," he said, slamming the door behind him. When the sound of his car faded into the night, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. Nate sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders, his presence steadying me, even as my world crumbled. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. But as I looked at him, I couldn't help but wonder if we already had too much to lose. The moment the words left my mouth, "Tom's not exactly the strong type, you know," I saw his face drop, and I knew I'd gone too far. But I didn't expect his best friend to step in and show me what strength really feels like. It was one of those nights where the wine was flowing too freely, and the casual banter had started to slip into dangerous territory. The dinner party was supposed to be fun, a chance for Tom and me to mingle with his old friends, people I didn't particularly care for, but tolerated for his sake. The conversation had started innocently enough. A group of middle-aged men sitting around the table, swapping stories about fixing things around the house or handling tricky situations at work. It was all very, "who's the manliest man here?" which I found ridiculous and a little boring. I'd heard these conversations 100 times before, but tonight something about it grated on me. Maybe it was the wine. Or maybe it was the growing frustration I felt every time I looked at Tom. His slouched shoulders, the way he laughed nervously at jokes that weren't funny, how he always seemed to fade into the background even in a room full of his closest friends. Whatever it was, it made me say it. "Tom? Strong?" I laughed, the sound too sharp, too loud. Please, he couldn't fix a leaky faucet if his life depended on it. The laughter around the table was immediate, a mix of surprise and amusement. Some of the men tried to stifle it, glancing awkwardly at Tom. But others, like Greg, who'd always enjoyed being the loudest guy in the room, let out booming laughs that filled the space. Tom's face turned crimson. He forced a tight smile, chuckling along as if the joke didn't cut him to the bone, but I could see it in his eyes. I'd humiliated him, and he was scrambling to save face. "Come on, Claire," Jack said from across the table, his voice calm, but cutting through the laughter like a knife. "That's a little harsh, don't you think?" The room went quiet, all eyes turning to Jack. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. Jack had always had that presence, commanding, self-assured. While the other men around the table carried the softness of middle age, Jack still had the sharp edges of someone who took care of himself, his broad shoulders and tanned skin, a testament to his years of physical labor as a contractor. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "I'm just being honest. It's not like Tom doesn't know it's true." Tom didn't say a word. He just stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing some fresh air, and walked out of the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the weight of their stares, the judgment hanging thick in the air. I wanted to snap at them, to tell them to mind their own business. But instead, I reached for my wine glass and drained what was left. Jack was the first to break the tension. He stood, grabbing the bottle of red from the center of the table and walking over to me. Without a word, he refilled my glass, then leaned down, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You don't pull punches, do you?" he said, his breath warm against my ear. I looked up at him, caught off guard by how close he was. "Someone had to say it," I replied, though my voice lacked the confidence I wanted it to have. He straightened up, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he walked back to his seat. The rest of the evening was a blur of strained conversations and polite small talk. Tom didn't come back inside, and I didn't go after him. Part of me felt guilty, but another part, the part that had been simmering with resentment for years, couldn't bring itself to care. It wasn't until later, after the other guests had started to leave, that Jack approached me again. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing out my glass and trying to avoid the awkward goodbyes. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, lacking the sharpness it had earlier. I turned to face him, surprised by the genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint hint of cologne mixed with the woodsy scent of his skin. "Tom will get over it," he said. "He always does." His words weren't comforting. If anything, they made me feel worse. Was that what our marriage had become? A series of slights and insults, with Tom quietly enduring and me quietly resenting him for it? "Maybe he shouldn't," I said, more to myself than to Jack. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You know," he said after a moment, "for someone who's so tough on him, you don't seem all that happy yourself." The comment hit harder than I wanted to admit. I looked away, focusing on the water swirling down the sink. "What's your point, Jack?" "My point," he said, stepping even closer, "is that you deserve to be with someone who makes you happy. Someone who knows how to handle a woman like you." I froze, the air between us crackling with tension. When I looked up at him, his expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intent in his eyes. "Jack?" I started, but he cut me off. "Think about it," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You're too damn good to be stuck in a marriage where you're not appreciated." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my thoughts racing. The ride home with Tom that night was silent. He didn't ask me what Jack had said, and I didn't offer to tell him. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, I couldn't stop replaying Jack's words in my head. "You deserve better." For the first time in a long time, I wondered if he was right. Tom left me in the kitchen, humiliated. But Jack stayed behind, and when he leaned in close to speak, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, like I was the center of someone's world again. The next morning, Tom didn't say a word about the dinner party. He left for work early, his coffee untouched on the counter, and I let him go without trying to make small talk. I told myself it was better this way. He needed time to cool off, and I wasn't in the mood for another fight. But the silence he left behind, was deafening. By noon, I was still in my pajamas, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to answer work emails. The truth was I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to last night, to the way Tom had looked at me, hurt and humiliated, and then, inevitably, to the way Jack had looked at me, like he could see right through me. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd read too much into a few words and a lingering glance. But the memory of his voice, low and confident, whispering that I deserved more, it stuck with me in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. It was late afternoon when the knock came. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat, before opening the door. And there he was, Jack, standing on my porch with a bottle of wine in one hand and a crooked smile on his face. "Jack?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What are you doing here?" "I figured you could use a drink," he said, holding up the bottle like it was the answer to everything. "Consider it an apology for last night." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't owe me an apology," he smirked. "Maybe not, but I doubt Tom's going to show up with flowers and an I'm sorry card, so..." He trailed off, shrugging. I knew I should have told him to leave, that it wasn't appropriate for him to be here, but instead, I found myself stepping aside. "Fine. One glass," I said. Jack made himself comfortable in the living room while I grabbed 2 glasses from the kitchen. By the time I joined him, he'd already uncorked the bottle and was pouring, his easy confidence filling the space in a way that felt strangely comforting. "To making it through awkward dinner parties," he said, raising his glass. I laughed despite myself, clinking my glass against his. "I'll drink to that." We talked for a while, the conversation surprisingly light. Jack had a way of making people feel at ease, of drawing them in with his charm and quick wit. He told me stories about his latest construction projects, about the clients who drove him crazy, and the ones who made him laugh. For a little while, I forgot about the tension with Tom, the growing cracks in our marriage. With Jack, it was easy to feel like the woman I used to be, confident, fun, maybe even a little desirable. But then the conversation shifted. "So," Jack said, swirling the wine in his glass, "are you and Tom okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" He leaned back against the couch, his eyes fixed on me. "Because last night didn't exactly scream happy marriage." I sighed, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "It's complicated." "Complicated," he repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "That's what people say when they don't want to admit things are falling apart." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Because he was right. Things were falling apart, and no amount of pretending could fix that. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, I've been Tom's friend for years. I've seen him at his best and his worst, but I've never understood why he doesn't fight for you." His words hit like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way he treats you," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Like you're just there. Like he's not terrified of losing you." My breath caught, and I looked away, staring at the wall to avoid the intensity of his gaze. "It's not that simple," I said quietly. "Isn't it?" he asked, his tone softening. "You deserve someone who sees you, Claire. Someone who doesn't take you for granted." When I looked at him again, his expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the heat in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about Tom anymore. "Jack." I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He set his glass down and moved closer, his knee brushing against mine. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "You're too good for this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too good to spend your life feeling like you're not enough." My heart was pounding, my pulse loud in my ears as his hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheek. "Then why are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us and the unbearable weight of the moment. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice raw and unguarded. "And I don't think I want to." I should have stopped him. I should have pushed him away, told him to leave before we did something we couldn't take back. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my breath hitching as his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters, but then his hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the floodgates broke. His kiss was nothing like Tom's. It was hungry, urgent, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for years. My hands found their way to his chest, his shirt warm and slightly rough beneath my fingertips. "Claire," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with restraint. "Tell me to stop." I couldn't. I didn't want to. "Don't," I whispered, my fingers tangling in his hair. That was all the permission he needed. Before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, his hands exploring my body like he was memorizing every inch of me. His touch was firm yet gentle, confident in a way that made my head spin. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, seen. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in him, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me that this was dangerous, that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. "Jack," I breathed, my voice shaky. "We can't." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't name. "Tell me to leave," he said, his voice raw. "If that's what you want, tell me and I'll go." I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because I didn't want him to leave. And in that moment, I wasn't thinking about Tom, or the consequences, or what this would mean for the future. All I could think about was Jack. When his lips found mine again, I stopped thinking, stopped worrying, stopped caring. Jack made me forget everything but the way he made me feel. I don't remember how we ended up in the den. One moment we were on the couch, and the next, Jack was leading me down the hallway, his hand warm and firm around mine. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly, the world outside didn't exist. No husband, no consequences, no judgment. Just the sound of my breathing, heavy and uneven, and the weight of Jack's gaze as he turned to face me. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a floor lamp in the corner. It cast long shadows across Jack's face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, a little rough. I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire. I should have said no. I should have walked away, but the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel, was impossible to ignore. For years I'd been invisible, taken for granted, and now, here was Jack, making me feel like I was the only thing that mattered. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I don't want you to stop." He didn't need any more encouragement. His hands were on me in an instant, sliding up my arms and pulling me close. When his lips met mine, it was like a dam breaking. Everything I'd been holding back, all the frustration and longing, spilling out at once. The kiss was deeper this time, more urgent. His hands found my waist, his grip firm but not demanding, as if he was giving me the chance to take the lead. I didn't hesitate, my fingers tangled in his hair, tugging slightly, and he groaned softly against my mouth. "Claire," he murmured, his voice thick with want. "You're driving me crazy." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I pressed closer, my body fitting against his like we were meant to be this way. His hands slid lower, tracing the curve of my hips, and I gasped as he lifted me effortlessly, setting me on the edge of the desk that dominated the room. For a moment, he pulled back, his breathing ragged as he studied me. His thumb brushed over my cheek, down to my lips, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "This isn't just a one-time thing for me," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You need to know that." His words hit me like a jolt. This wasn't just about desire for him, it was more than that. And as much as I wanted to keep pretending this was just a fleeting moment, I couldn't ignore the way my heart skipped at his confession. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I know I don't want it to stop." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then let me take care of you." The next moments blurred together in a haze of heat and urgency. His hands were everywhere, on my neck, my waist, my thighs, touching me in ways that sent sparks racing across my skin. He kissed me like he was trying to memorize the taste of me, his lips trailing down my jaw to the hollow of my throat. My dress slipped from my shoulders, pooling around my waist, and his hands found bare skin. The contrast of his rough palms against my softness made me shiver, and I couldn't stop the small gasp that escaped my lips. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he said, his voice low and steady, even as his touch grew bolder. I don't, I whispered, my fingers curling around the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. His mouth found mine again, and this time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw and unrestrained, a collision of want and need that left me breathless. I wasn't prepared for how gentle he could be. Despite the fire between us, he moved slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring every moment. His touch was confident but patient, his lips brushing against mine as he whispered my name like it was the most natural thing in the world. Claire, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my skin. You're incredible. The words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from something I couldn't quite name. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like this, touched me like this, made me feel this alive. I let myself get lost in him, in the way he made me feel like the most important person in the world. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Tom or work or the endless list of responsibilities waiting for me. There was only Jack, and the way his hands and lips and voice pulled me back to life. When it was over, we stayed like that for a while, tangled together in the quiet of the den. The only sound was our breathing, slowly evening out as the adrenaline faded. Jack's hand brushed against mine, his fingers lacing with mine in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though the answer felt complicated. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. Neither do I, he said. But I know I don't regret this. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I wanted to tell him I didn't regret it either, but the words felt too big, too heavy. Instead, I rested my head against his chest, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothe the chaos in my mind. But the quiet didn't last. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I registered the sound of the front door opening. My body tensed, and I sat up quickly, my heart pounding as the reality of the situation crashed over me. Tom, I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded, helping me gather my things as quickly as possible. I smoothed my dress, running trembling fingers through my hair in a desperate attempt to look normal. Jack opened the door a crack, glancing down the hallway before turning back to me. He's in the kitchen, he said quietly. Go upstairs, I'll handle this. I hesitated, my stomach twisting with guilt and fear. Jack. It's okay, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've got this. I nodded, slipping out of the room and hurrying upstairs, my heart racing with every step. I didn't know how much Tom had seen or heard, but as I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking in my lap, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I looked into his eyes that night, I didn't see anger. I didn't see heartbreak. What I saw in Tom's face was far worse. Cold, calculated revenge. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, waiting for the sound of Tom's footsteps, but they never came. I heard Jack leave shortly after. The front door closed quietly, without a word exchanged between him and Tom, and I imagined Jack walking away with his usual confidence. He always seemed unshaken, no matter the situation. But me? I felt like I was falling apart, piece by piece. When I finally crept downstairs in the early morning light, the house was eerily quiet. Tom's briefcase was gone, his car missing from the driveway. For a moment, I let out a shaky breath, telling myself maybe he hadn't seen anything. Maybe he didn't know. But that was wishful thinking. Tom didn't mention the night before when he came home later that evening. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. In fact, he acted like nothing had happened. He sat at the dinner table, ate the bland chicken I'd cooked without a word, and stared at his phone like I wasn't even there. That eerie calmness, it was worse than any shouting match we could have had. Tom, I ventured hesitantly as he poured himself a glass of scotch after dinner. Huh? He didn't look up from his phone. About last night. He froze for just a second. It was subtle, a slight pause as he set the glass down, but I caught it. His head tilted slightly, and when he finally looked at me, his expression was unreadable. Let's not do this right now, he said, his tone as flat as his face. It's been a long day. I wanted to push, to ask him what he meant, but something about the way he stared at me, a coldness in his eyes I'd never seen before, made me stop. The days that followed were tense. Tom acted like his usual self, going to work, coming home, eating dinner, and sleeping in the same bed as me, but something was off. His politeness felt forced, his smiles too tight, and every now and then I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I was imagining things. Paranoia. Guilt. I'd been caught up in something reckless and stupid, and now I was paying the price. But then, on the fourth night, I found the envelope. It was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came downstairs, next to my coffee cup. At first I thought it was another stack of bills, but when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside were photos of me and Jack. At first, they were innocent enough, me laughing as Jack poured me a glass of wine, the two of us talking in the living room. But as I flipped through them, they became less innocent. A shot of Jack leaning in close, his hand brushing my hair. Another of us in the den, his body pressed against mine as we kissed. And then there was a photo taken through the barely open door. A photo that left no room for misinterpretation. I dropped the pictures like they'd burned me, my hands shaking as I stared at them scattered across the counter. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned, only to find Tom standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with his arms crossed. "Interesting photos, aren't they?" he said, his voice eerily calm. "Tom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can explain." He held up a hand, silencing me. "Don't bother, I don't want to hear your excuses." "Then why?" "Because," he said, cutting me off again, "I thought you should see what I've been dealing with, what I've had to watch." My stomach twisted painfully. You took these?" "No," he said, almost amused. "But I did install the security cameras, remember? Apparently you forgot." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cameras. I'd forgotten about the damn cameras. They'd been Tom's idea, a safety precaution for the house, though I'd thought they were overkill at the time. "Why are you showing me these?" I asked, my voice shaky. Tom's expression didn't change. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a USB drive, holding it up between his fingers. "This," he said, "is the video." I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Don't worry," he continued, his voice calm but dripping with venom. "I haven't shown it to anyone, yet." "Tom, please," I begged, stepping closer. "You can't." "Can't?" He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, Claire, I can. And I will if I feel like it." "What do you want?" I asked desperately. He smirked, setting the USB drive down on the counter and folding his arms again. "I don't know yet, but for now I suggest you start behaving yourself. Unless you want your coworkers, your friends, or your family to see exactly what kind of woman you really are." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. "You're doing this to punish me," I said, my voice breaking. "No, Claire," he said, leaning closer. "I'm doing this to remind you who's in control." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't recognize this version of Tom, the calm, cruel man standing in front of me. He wasn't yelling, wasn't breaking things, wasn't threatening to leave. He was methodical, calculating, and that made him far more dangerous. For the next few days, I lived in constant fear. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be a text from Tom, telling me he'd sent the video to someone. Every time he looked at me, I felt exposed, like he could see every one of my secrets. Jack called once, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. I wanted to tell him everything, to ask for his help, but I knew involving him would only make things worse. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making, with no way out. Tom didn't bring up the video again, but he didn't have to. The threat of it lingered over everything, a constant reminder of how easily he could destroy me. But what scared me the most wasn't the video itself. It was the realization that Tom had no intention of letting me go. This wasn't about revenge. It was about control. I thought I could live with his threats, that I could find a way to endure. But the more he smiled, the more I realized he wasn't going to stop until he broke me completely. Tom didn't need to remind me of the video. He didn't need to say a single word about it. The knowledge that it existed, that it could destroy everything I'd built, was enough. He wielded that power silently, his presence looming over every moment like a storm cloud. At first I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. I went to work, handled my meetings, and smiled at my coworkers like my world wasn't collapsing. But the weight of it all began to crack me. Every email notification felt like a ticking bomb. Every glance from Tom across the dinner table felt like a knife pressing against my throat. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to hit me. His silence, his subtle smiles, his calm, calculated control, it was far worse. One evening, about a week after the confrontation, I found him sitting in the living room with a glass of scotch. The lights were dim, the flicker of the TV illuminating his face. He wasn't watching the show, it was just background noise. "Tom," I said, standing in the doorway, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me. "Huh? I can't do this anymore." That got his attention. He set the glass down on the coffee table and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Do what, Claire?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely. "Living like this, waiting for you to ruin me." He leaned back, resting an arm on the back of the couch. "Ruin you? Is that what you think I'm doing?" "Yes," I said, my voice stronger now. "You're punishing me. You're holding this over my head so you can control me." He tilted his head, studying me like I was an equation he was trying to solve. "You think you're the victim here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You humiliated me, Claire. You betrayed me. And now you're upset because I didn't just roll over and take it?" "I made a mistake," I admitted, my hands trembling. "But this, what you're doing, it's not about us anymore. It's about power." Tom's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might snap. But then he stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and took a step toward me. "You want to talk about power?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You had all the power the night you decided to sleep with Jack. You had the power to destroy this marriage. And you did. I'm just making sure you don't destroy anything else." I backed away, my heart pounding as he closed the distance between us. "You don't have to do this?" I whispered. "Don't I?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "You made your choice, Claire. Now you get to live with it." I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. I couldn't stay here, not with him holding that video over me. But leaving wasn't an option either. If he released the video, it would ruin me, my career, my reputation, everything. I needed help. The thought of calling Jack made my chest tighten. I hadn't spoken to him since that night. I hadn't even answered his text messages, afraid of what Tom might do if he found out. But as the hours dragged on, I realized I didn't have a choice. The next day, while Tom was at work, I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, staring at my phone. My fingers hovered over Jack's name, my chest tight with anxiety. Finally, I pressed call. "Claire," he said after the first ring, his voice laced with relief. "I was starting to think you weren't going to talk to me again." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. I didn't know what to say. "You don't have to apologize," he said gently. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "No," I admitted, "I'm not." "What happened?" he asked, his tone sharp with concern. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Tom knows about us," I said. "He has the video." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "What do you mean he has the video?" "I mean he recorded us," I said, my voice cracking. "He's been holding it over my head ever since. I don't know what to do, Jack." "I'll take care of it," he said immediately. "No," I said quickly. "You can't. If you confront him, he'll use it against both of us." "Then what do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice softening. "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I just needed to tell someone. I can't do this alone." "You're not alone," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out, Claire, I promise." That night, I felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that Jack was on my side. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely powerless. But that calm didn't last long. When I got home, Tom was waiting for me. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the USB drive in front of him. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Running errands," I said, keeping my voice steady. He nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. "You know, I've been thinking about our situation," he said, "and I've decided something." "What's that?" I asked warily. "I think it's time we renegotiate the terms of this marriage," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I mean," he said, leaning forward, "if you want me to keep this little incident between us, you're going to have to start pulling your weight around here." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means you're going to do exactly what I say when I say it." he said, his tone calm but firm. No more backtalk, no more attitude. You're going to be the perfect wife, Claire, or everyone's going to know exactly what kind of woman you really are. The weight of his words crushed me, leaving me speechless. As I sat there staring at the man I'd once loved, I realized something. Tom wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let this go. And if I didn't find a way out, he was going to destroy me. Tom thought he'd broken me, that I'd fall in line and accept his rules. But the moment I stepped outside that door, I knew there was no going back. It was time to take control of my life, no matter the cost. The morning after Tom's ultimatum, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same USB drive he'd used to hold me hostage. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, as I replayed his words in my head over and over again. The perfect wife. Or everyone will know exactly what kind of woman you really are. I knew what he wanted. He wanted control. Absolute, suffocating control. And for the past week, I'd given it to him. I cooked his meals, smiled politely, and even laughed at his jokes when he brought up work. I played my part so perfectly that even he seemed convinced I was broken. But I wasn't broken. I was waiting. That afternoon I met Jack. I chose a public park, somewhere quiet but open, where I wouldn't feel trapped. I told him everything. Tom's threats, the USB drive, the photos, the unbearable weight of pretending everything was fine. Jack sat silently, his jaw clenched as he listened, his fists tightening on the table. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a slow, controlled breath. "He's a bastard," he said finally, "a manipulative, spineless bastard." "You're not wrong," I said, managing a weak smile. He leaned forward again, his voice low. "You don't have to stay, Claire. You don't have to let him control you." "I don't have a choice," I whispered. "If he releases that video, it'll ruin me. I'll lose everything, my job, my reputation." "Then we take the video," Jack said, his tone firm. I stared at him, my heart racing. "What are you saying?" "We get the USB drive," he said. "Destroy it. Destroy every copy he has." "It's not that simple," I said, shaking my head. "Tom isn't stupid. He probably has backups." Jack reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Then we find them all. And if we can't, we make sure that bastard knows he's not the only one who can play dirty." I didn't know if it was Jack's confidence or my growing desperation, but I nodded. "Okay," I said quietly, "but we have to be careful. If Tom catches on." "He won't," Jack said firmly. "Not if we're smart." That night, I went home and played my part again. Tom was sitting on the couch watching one of his crime dramas, a glass of scotch in hand. "You're late," he said without looking at me. "I stopped to get groceries," I said, holding up the bag. He grunted in response, his eyes glued to the TV. I set the bag down in the kitchen and glanced at the USB drive still sitting on the counter. It hadn't moved since the night he'd left it there. My fingers itched to grab it, to throw it down the garbage disposal and be done with it. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I needed a plan. The next day, I waited until Tom left for work before searching the house. I started with his office, rifling through drawers, checking the computer, even digging through the filing cabinets, but there was nothing. Frustrated, I moved to the bedroom. I checked under the bed, in the closet, in every drawer and box I could find. And then, tucked in the back of his nightstand, I found it, a small, black external hard drive. My heart pounded as I plugged it into my laptop. Sure enough, the folder labeled Home Security was right there. I opened it, my stomach twisting as I saw the files, videos, photos, everything he'd recorded. I copied the folder to a flash drive, my hands trembling the entire time. That evening, I met Jack again, handing him the flash drive. "This is everything," I said, my voice shaking, "at least everything I could find." Jack nodded, slipping the drive into his pocket. "I'll take care of it," he said. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Make sure Tom doesn't have anything to hold over you anymore," he said simply. When I got home that night, Tom was waiting for me. He was sitting in the living room, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "Out," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Out where?" "Running errands," I said, brushing past him. He grabbed my wrist, stopping me. "Don't lie to me, Claire." I froze, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. "I'm not lying." For a moment he stared at me, his grip tightening just enough to hurt. Then slowly he let me go. "Be careful," he said quietly, his voice a warning. "You're playing a dangerous game." The next few days passed in a blur. Jack kept his word, wiping every file on the flash drive and leaving no trace of Tom's blackmail. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that the worst was over, fear of what Tom would do when he realized he'd lost his leverage. But when the confrontation finally came, it wasn't what I expected. It happened on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table sipping my coffee when Tom walked in. He looked calm, too calm, and that terrified me. "You've been busy," he said, his tone casual. I froze. "What are you talking about?" He smirked, holding up his phone. "I had backups, Claire. Did you really think you could outsmart me?" My blood turned to ice. "But don't worry," he said, setting the phone down on the table. "I'm not going to ruin you. Not yet, anyway." "What do you want?" I whispered. He leaned closer, his eyes cold. "I want you to remember who's in charge. I want you to think long and hard before you try something like this again." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Tom wasn't just holding the video over me anymore. He was holding my entire life in his hands. And I realized then that he wasn't going to stop. Not until I was completely under his control. That was the moment I made my decision. The next morning, I packed a bag. I left while Tom was at work, taking nothing but my essentials and the flash drive Jack had given me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove away, the weight on my chest began to lift. I wasn't free. Not yet. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my life. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Tom win.